The mainstream consensus in the West still treats this war as a frozen stalemate heading nowhere. The consensus is wrong, and what has happened in the past few days makes that harder to argue than ever. As of this morning, the Victory Day ceasefire has expired. Last night alone, Russia launched over 200 drones at Ukrainian territory within hours of the truce's formal end. And yet, paradoxically, the opening for negotiation framework has never been wider. Not because the war is over or even close to ending, but because the underlying pressures on all three principal parties have, for the first time since 2022, converged in a way that makes a managed pause increasingly hard to avoid. Start with the ground situation, because the numbers tells a story that most analysts are still missing. Russia controls approximately 118,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, around 20% of the country. That includes Crimea, held since 2014, Luhansk, where Russian forces now hold roughly 99.8% of the oblast, but have failed, despite three separate official declarations, to complete its capture, with Ukrainian forces still holding the settlements in several parts. And according to estimations, each of these announcements has been part of a coordinated Kremlin information campaign designed to create pressure on Ukraine to stay Donetsk at the negotiation table. Beyond Luhansk, Russia holds approximately 80% of Donetsk and large stretches of Zaporizhia and Kherson. On paper, that sounds like a position of strength. In practice, it has come at a catastrophic cost, an estimated 350,000 Russian soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in 2025 alone, for a net territorial gain under 5,000 square kilometers over the entire year. What the figures don't capture is a directional shift. In the 4 weeks ending May 5, Russia actually lost net 119 square kilometers, a reversal of the preceding period's modest gains. Ukraine has been striking targets 500 to 1,500 kilometers deep into Russian territories, and this has been possible thanks to the growing precision and regularity of Ukrainian drone attacks. This is no longer a war of Russian advance and Ukrainian attrition. It is a war in which Russia's structural fragility is compounding, while Ukraine is adapting faster than its adversary can absorb. Which is the context you need to read Putin's victory's remarks correctly. On the evening of May 9, Putin told journalists the conflict was drawing to a close. He expressed readiness to meet Zelensky directly. He framed any talks as a bilateral matter between Russia and Ukraine, with American mediation welcome but not decisive. Taken at face value, this sounds like an opening. It isn't, or at least not in the way Western capitals are choosing to read it. What Putin's language actually does is serve three overlapping purposes at once. It projects confidence that time favors Moscow, even as the battlefield contradicts that. It sets a procedural bar high enough, pre-agreed outcomes before any summit, to allow Russia to stall indefinitely while appearing constructive. And by insisting on bilateralism, it signals that Moscow sees this as a negotiation between great powers, not a process in which Ukrainian sovereignty is the organizing principle. But the most telling thing is not what Putin said. It is that he said anything at all. A leader who genuinely believed military momentum will deliver his objectives would let the battlefield speak. The fact that he chose to reframe the war publicly on a more symbolically loaded date tells you that the battlefield is no longer delivering what he promised. Putin is not looking for a ceasefire because he has lost. He is looking for one because continuing under current conditions risks losing something more important than territory, the economic foundation of the regime itself. Inflation is elevated and persistent. The central bank is holding interest rates at levels that are strangling domestic investment. The defense industrial complex is consuming an ever-growing share of GDP without generating productivity elsewhere. And the fourth systemic crisis, the multiplicative cascading disruptions across oil, gas, fertilizers, and food triggered by Operation Fury on February 28, is accelerating a global recession that Russia's war-distorted economy is structurally ill-placed to survive. Zelensky has read these dynamics accurately, and his handling of the past week reflects it. The Victory Day ceasefire was already the second short-term truce of 2026. The first came during Orthodox Easter. Two tactical pauses in 6 weeks is not a coincidence. It is a pattern and it is accelerating. Ukraine declared its own unilateral ceasefire from May 5, broader in scope and earlier in timing than Moscow's announcement, deliberately cornering the Kremlin into a position where every Russian strike became proof of bad faith. Kiev documented over 1,800 violations during that period. That figure is not incidental. It is a carefully constructed evidentiary record designed to deny any Western government the political cover to present Putin-timed truce as diplomatic breakthrough. The operational doctrine Zelensky has established is strict reciprocity. Ukrainian forces will hold fire where Russia does, and continued Russian attacks will be answered with long-range strikes deep inside Russian territory. The message to Moscow is clear. Ceasefire can improve Russia's immediate security situation, but only if it is actually honored. This is meaningful shift in leverage. So, where does this lead? What does the architecture of real negotiated framework actually look like from here? The US Ukraine Russia trilateral channel built around the Witkoff Kushner track has effectively stalled because of the ongoing war in Iran. Washington's diplomatic attention has moved toward the Iran-Hormuz crisis. Moscow sees no reason to make concessions while it believes it can wait. And Ukraine has spent the past year deepening its own defense industrial base and cultivating new international partnerships, which means that it's no longer wholly dependent on Washington as its strategic anchor. That shift creates room for something new, and the coming weeks and months may well force it into existence. The E3, which is France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, is positioning itself as co-architect of any durable framework. European Council President Costa has publicly acknowledged the European Union's potential role in negotiating with Russia on Europe's future security architecture. Putin's suggestion of Gerhard Schröder as a channel between Moscow and Brussels, whatever one makes of this choice of signals that Kremlin has accepted a European track as unavoidable. Germany, under Chancellor Merz, is recalibrating toward credible deterrence and toward diplomatic engagement at the same time, which is a more coherent position than Berlin has held in years. The architecture taking shape is therefore neither bilateral nor purely trilateral between United States, Russia, and Ukraine. It is parallel. US-Ukraine-Russia track for the core security parameters, US-Russia track for the future security dialogue between United States and Russia, and an E3 supported track covering the European dimension, including, of course, Ukrainian interests. And all of this is focused on territorial arrangement, reconstruction, sanctions architecture, and the longer-term security order on the old continent. All these tracks are not alternatives. They are mutually reinforcing, and neither can succeed without the other. Ukraine's red lines within this architecture are non-negotiable, and they should be understood as structural commitments rooted in the lived experience, not opening bargaining positions. No recognition of territorial laws, no ceasefire without a credible path toward a just settlement, no Russian preconditions that amount to capitulation dressed as diplomacy, no constraints on Ukraine's defense modernization below what Kiev considers its minimum deterrence threshold. This is where strategic sobriety has to temper any optimism about momentum. Russia violated more than 25 to 30 ceasefires within Ukraine between 2014 and 2022, every single one systemically and without consequence, until it was positioned to launch its full-scale invasion on 24th of February 2022. That is not background context, it is the analytical baseline. Moscow treats ceasefires as operational pauses inside a longer campaign, not as endpoints. A ceasefire in 2026 will not end this war. It will freeze it temporarily while Russia attempts to reconstitute military and economic capacity for the next phase. Putin's maximalist objectives, effective control over all of Ukraine, have not been abandoned. His strategy is a long war designed to stretch well past 2030. The next ceasefire, when it comes, will be peace without a peace treaty, a managed pause inside an unresolved conflict, carrying within it the seeds of the next confrontation, unless the West uses the time it provides to build something fundamentally different from what came after Minsk. And this is the reality that most European capitals have not yet reckoned with seriously. Ceasefire is not an end of, it is a transformation of confrontation into a new phase within the Cold War 2.0 framework, in which Russia remains a revanchist power with unresolved territorial claims, intact nuclear arsenal, and a governing class that regards the existing international order as a threat to be dismantled over time, not accommodated. In that phase, Europe faces the challenge it has spent decades avoiding, building the credible deterrence architecture necessary to live alongside hostile Russia, while managing the permanent risk of direct military confrontation and escalation. The eastern flank of NATO, from the Baltic states through Poland down to Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, will become the new Iron Curtain, not as a metaphor, but actually as a physical permanent frontier of military readiness that will define how Europeans plan and live for generations to come. Defense collaboration with Ukraine, for Ukraine, and in Ukraine is the cornerstone of that architecture. Not just any aid, not crisis management, strategic investment in the forward deterrence that Europe's own security now depends upon. Ukraine's defense industrial base, producing drones at industrial scale, developing long-range strike systems, integrating hard lessons from 4+ years of high-intensity warfare that no NATO member has experienced, is not a burden to be carried. It is a strategic asset to be developed jointly because its capabilities are now inseparable from Europe's own security calculus. The question before European leaders is not whether a ceasefire is coming. The trajectory of 2026 makes that increasingly clear. The question is whether Europe will use the space it creates to prepare seriously for what follows, or whether it will repeat the mistake it made after 2014, when the Minsk process, which everyone knew was failing, became a substitute for the strategic readiness that Europe did not have the political will to build. The ceasefire is coming, the Iron Curtain is forming. What Europe builds along it and with Ukraine will be the defining test of this generation's strategic seriousness.